Good evening, everyone. You're finding us jumping in mid-match because once again, one of my initial attempts at starting, everything failed. Now that I'm sure it's back up, welcome to another SixyTimes Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. I may be a little bit more quiet today, and we did have a little bit of trouble, not in a stream, but we did have a little bit of trouble with the main headset yesterday. It just basically didn't work at all. So despite the trouble of going to all that, getting a new cable and so on, I'm not necessarily using that one. Hopefully I'm still pretty audible, but it shouldn't matter too much because I don't plan to talk a lot in Lounge today. Even though we are seeing people coming in, it's not necessarily going to lead to them actually playing. People don't tend to hang around that long after all. But it is winner stays on today, as it almost always is now, with simply a restriction on how long you can play if you just keep winning. To make sure everyone gets more of a chance, that is, of course. Today we're mostly working on things like figuring out the perfect range for long range attacks. Working on offense, once again. But not the usual type of offense where it's just a matter of walking down your opponent perfectly and making them whiff or something. This is for dealing with the level beyond that, for dealing with the sort of player who explicitly will not whiff things if they can help it, and who generally won't approach. You can try to deal with this type of player by making sure you always hold their longest button when they do this, but it's not necessarily completely effective, as usually people have at least 2 such attacks, and being able to use them correctly usually means that you are getting 2 separate things happening, 2 things that must be held differently. But if we do have people in Lounge, I'll jump to back quick into spectate mode and let them have a match or 2, especially since people don't always stick around as long as I might expect them to. So, yeah. That might work. So they have moved one step closer to playing main. Here we have one character who is more so good at stopping this style of thing than she is at actually dealing it. I know Helena does have rushing style attacks, but they're not usually as strong and they don't lead to as much. Mainly because she's not really meant to be that type of character. A lot of space control and a lot of relatively longer range and condition protection, but she does have a couple of them. Nearly everyone in the game has something you can do either by moving up and doing like some quarter circle forward with kick or punch. Sometimes it's a half. And if that's not working, then just dash into some attack. Though in this game, when I say dash, I mean press forward once quickly, hold forward, and then whatever you want. More of a run. But once you've got it down, the main thing you usually need to understand is whether or not the move you're trying to do actually gets you an advantage, whether or not it's super easy to hold or telegraphed, and if you can do anything by faking the range of it, which is usually the most important aspect of it. All of these things tie into your offense because you can more easily get your opponent to think about whether or not you are going to do X or Y. But of course, nothing really works out properly if you can't get it to make sure that you will actually land the hit. That, for example, was a really good use of that, even that it doesn't actually look like it should hit at that range, but managed to barely clip. In this game, a lot of the time the lunging moves are a little bit misleading as to how far they're going to reach, so it's really important to test these and get used to what happens when you actually do whiff them. you already see Omni Rabbit sort of using optimals around that, not necessarily going for the same style of thing each time. I find that most characters beat this by just hitting P plus K, but I'm not sure why that seemed to be the universal choice that the designers made as the button to use to hit people who are rushing at you. It's a little easier to test this sort of thing against well-known opponents, but you can still definitely get some stuff out of it by testing with pretty much anyone, as long as you don't overdo it as much in that space. A more defensive player of the same character, for example, will be looking for different things. But it's always true and always quite possible to get good victories when you are playing very aggressively, or rather playing very strong or intending to play very strong offense. You can get a lot more out of it by just pausing that offense. There's no reason to specifically go on defense while you're doing it, but you can definitely just kind of stop and see what they do, catch your breath, especially in games like this where there's no way really for your opponent to quickly get into your face or make you block without much of the same style of attack. And as we've just noted, Helena might not have as many, but we have one Wi-Fi warrior here, which is usually not an entire problem, but we will see whether or not they've got any good approach style moves, which in turn gives Omni more chance to practice it only from the other side. Do I need to get over there? And if I don't need to get over there, what am I doing? The ability to quickly switch your mind off, even when playing offense, in the sense of trying to find a new way to get in, is really important. There we go. A good demonstration of why I would say that Helena's own aren't as strong. She tends to end up being with Punish because she's going for a low that has a relatively long recovery, and she can't easily defend fully after it. So the person who gets tapped by this move is not really so much afraid as they are looking for a better situation than Helena herself can throw out. In this case, I think it's best to just try to sort of sidestep still, but that does not mean that you're going to get away with it. If she does hit the move, or space it perfectly, you do have a little better option there. Because as you can see, she does have strikes, but these are also slightly predictable, so I'm not sure how laggy this is, but okay, that laggy. Because I'm pretty sure that that was a kill, but is kind of hard to perfect. When you are in this situation, as just demonstrated, a lot of the time your best option is to sidestep. Especially if your opponent seems to be running at you and you don't know what's about to happen, sidestep is often your best option simply because it's a good way to get out of the more obvious ones. And while your opponent is running, even though they might kind of track you, it's not the same thing. Technically, I find that Helena does a little better when that move is actually kind of slow. You get a better result out of trying to do something else first, and then as your opponent attempts to get out of your range, then you go in with that sort of rush attack. Understanding that a lot of these moves are for chasing and being misleading can really improve the way that you end up dealing with the opponent. I had the meter, and it's exactly at 6 seconds, so we are on brand for the theme today. And the report I have about the lag is that it is fine overall and just occasionally spikes weirdly, so that was probably not the reason for anything that went wrong there. Maybe a combo drop or two. A relatively critical one, but still. Well, and had a lot of quick battles here. We're going into play with at least one character who defends, and usually defends, that is, and one character who has a lot of moves and abilities. So let's see what we get. From the other side, I'm being told that this is not really working as well, sound-wise, so I guess I'll have to go back to the other headset for any further streams. But for today, I'm going to assume that I don't really have time or reason to make a lot of changes now. Sorry for whatever issues you're having with the audio. I hear it's mostly cutting out, but if I say much less, then it's not likely to happen as much. Both these players showing a lot of patience and adaptation, particularly in a way that makes me think that I'll get a good match, but also a very difficult one. When a player is relatively set in their understanding of whether or not you should go in further or not, like we've seen this player hit things, specifically stop, wait for the opponent to try to hold, and then throw them. But because throws do track, your options in this situation are basically get out of the way, figure out the block for the next attack correctly regardless, or go for your own strike. Kasumi is quick enough to go for her own strike in a lot of situations, but her main problem here will simply be that the opponent is plus, and how much they delay is mostly just a matter of their preference. So I'm going to end up trying to figure out what the rhythm of my opponent is while still attacking, because it doesn't make sense to defend too much under that scenario either. I'm going to be trying to do much of the same thing. It works well with Kasumi. I have good reasons to do it, but what I expect to happen is that anyone who goes into a match with that mindset is going to be so good at defending it that I'm not going to actually land most of these throws. Particularly not on this character. Let's go. We are playing a game, or a level of game, you don't get to see too often in this game. Both of us are staying at exactly a range where a lot of things are possible, but we don't necessarily want to take any actions. For that reason, for example. The constant, very small hesitation is basically us showing you we understand what the other person's doing, but we don't understand the timing. For example, should I have gone for a throw there or not? A lot of the rest of it is going to be in neutral, trying to mislead the opponent as to what range you need to be at. Because if you're always slightly out of range, it's easier to do stuff like this. But I got as good as I gave. There are too many situations in that match where I would then have to go back and rewatch the stream myself to go, wait, did I actually do something that was a good idea? Or did I win that interaction because I did something that was a terrible idea? Such a bad idea that my skilled opponent did not think at any point that I would do it. So I'm probably, assuming that they stick around, going to get to find that out another way. Feel free to jump in if you would like to play, and as we've just seen from the on-screen, there is a match 2 slot open for those who want to go practice something else or just get more practice, and particularly for those who want to do that without being visible on stream. This matchup tends to be a little bit more complicated in terms of demonstrations. My opponent does play somewhat defensively, but the best way to deal with that is more so to force a block, and force a block that I'm comfortable with. And for that, on Kasumi's side, it's not a matter of getting out of the range and doing special things. It's a matter of hitting that until things turn out my way, more or less. But if the spacing is off, then the same problem occurs. P can be helpful for this reason, but it's not enough by itself. Mainly because of that sidestep, and some other aspects of general play against this character. Because of the timing it takes for her moves to come out, it's usually easier to hit her out of things than it is to actually hold. This is a common problem. Momiji has it too, but it's not one that you could easily resolve. You have to generally hope that because she does relatively smaller damage in many situations, you can just get out of the situation differently. So, I'm back to the same problem as before. But there is a way to deal with it at range as well. An opponent who doesn't want to get into your space because they're trying to defend correctly at that range is easier to handle by hitting the correct P attack. But I did not break through. You can see that it was basically defense the entire time. So I would have had to break through that in multiple ways to get a different style of match. The optimal thing for me to do when facing an opponent defending that hard is to not act at all, because if they have a weakness in their offense, and that's the reason they're not playing any offense, then you have a better option by just getting some life lead and then not really doing anything. You can also just hit certain moves that you know will leave you at a safe spot and see if your opponent backs off even more, even if they've blocked it correctly. You can absolutely learn to block through certain Kokoro strings, but because of the game's tendency to shift whether or not you can block or counter, i.e. hold, in situations where you have been hit already, particularly where you've been counter hit, you won't necessarily be able to do it consistently. Helena's best bet, therefore, particularly in this matchup, because she doesn't have strong enough offense to get through all of this, and tends to take damage more so trying to do her space control and then missing and being hit. Her best bet here is to flow like water, to do nothing of importance at any point, to just act entirely on instinct and whim and never feel the need to do anything. Because this is an overwhelming style of situation, and the way Kokoro does damage means that it's like, it's alright. Being able to just calmly measure the space between yourself and your opponent and not think too hard about whether or not you're actually going to get hit. Because you're going to get hit. It could be under your terms, it could be under their terms, but you don't really have to care so much when the thing that your opponent is doing is either offense that isn't particularly damaging or strong in terms of like structure, or isn't playing offense at all. The one thing that will come up though is that throwing is more important than any other aspect of this. Not because the throw is the way that damage is going to happen, but because the opponent has to think about whether or not the throw is a danger to them or not. That, for example, was the best example. Kokoro doesn't reach far enough that once she's gone all the way back there, that you have to worry about something actually hitting you. In fact, the amount of times you see an attack from the wolf whiff and could be grabbed, but our Helena finds herself trying to hold the next attack is quite high. It's not necessary to do this because the opponent's offensive structure isn't strong enough yet. He's definitely working on it, but it's not strong enough yet that your response to your opponent striking at a space in front of you should be, I must defend myself with holds. You can just press throw because they're not going to actually hit you, and if they hit you, it's not going to matter as much. There's also a lot of interactions in this game where the throw itself actually like grabs the limb or something. This happens in other games as well. But usually you actually do get struck. It's just that for whatever reason, the way that you get struck shifts, so it's easier to just not worry about it. This is a little easier for Honoka because of her arsenal of moves that hit basically straight on around mid-level from relatively longer ranges and confirm into other stuff. Because these are the types of moves that do manage to interrupt your opponent's approaches even while they're attempting to strike. She also has at least 2 different methods of trying to get through the opponent's moves while still doing a specific style of throw. It's absolutely not necessary to advance as much, but it's really often true that if the Kokoro player is playing with their offense in a specific style, your goal should never be to hold what is happening, but simply to throw her whenever she stops. And you're much more likely to come out of that usefully than the other way around. She can definitely be a whirlwind of different things happening, but this usually only works when she has done enough to get her into a position she likes, and then you just move on from there. It also helps because it prevents you from having to stand in certain spaces for too long. And of course, saves you a lot of meter. Definitely a good character to force you to specifically learn not only the range of all your throws, but the frame data of all your throws. An opponent who fears moving into your throw range and getting thrown will use different styles of attack, as just demonstrated, and you'll be able to push them off a little bit differently. So while the absolute outcome of, hey, I'm pressing throw now, isn't necessarily a response that will win you the match by itself, there's a lot of nuance that gets added to the match because you're willing to go for the throw in those situations, allowing you to do that, save your meter for the times you're absolutely sure that the break hold is required, rather than the other type. Being ready on the throw button also obviously helps when you have been blocking for long enough that your opponent is now thinking about the fact that they want to throw you. Combine this with the general capacity to just hit high attacks and push her off, and you've got a strategy that will normally take you longer to lose, and that alone is usually enough to figure out which part of your strategy needs to change according to this particular opponent's mindset. Down strike? No down strike. I think in general this matchup is harder. For much the same reason, but in the opposite direction. If Honoka keeps on attacking, she will eventually put herself in one of Tina's throw ranges. She has so many of them. and this stage is not going to help the matter. But playing defense isn't going to work out either. This is another one of those situations where you're better off from both sides of this matchup hitting your opponent once as a punish, not actually trying to do your combo, because they both have relatively predictable combos. Hit your opponent once and then go for the throw. If you think, for whatever reason, that you're not going to get away with the hit, that it's not a good idea to go for the hit, just throw immediately. That's basically all you need to understand. It's good to be able to break down most fighting games to that aspect of the interaction. Should I move for this thing right now? Should I hit my opponent or not? When complicated things are happening, that's helpful. Because here, all you care about is, can I stop this attack on me? Not necessarily, can I get everything? Can I get every combo? Can I push forward consistently? The matchup doesn't tend to rely too much on that I've ever seen. But of course, Tina does big damage if you end up in her throw range without being prepared. Part of the reason this happens, especially in this type of game, is that you end up with a position change problem. If you hit your opponent off you, and you haven't hit them far enough, your situation's bad. But if you did hit them far enough, it was probably because you did something predictable, some combo or something that will get you to that spot. So that there was perfectly done. Hit once, go for a throw. And of course, the answer to this usually is, once you've been hit once after your own offense, see if you can get back out of the way. Backdashing is effective enough in a lot of these situations, and your opponent has to make a much harder read, usually, in order to catch your backdash than they would have to if they were just trying to reach out with their next hit. This is particularly useful when you are playing against a character whose second hit in their combo strings isn't a much further sweeping hit than the first. If they just kind of double jab you or something, in a punish situation it might be possible for you to just backdash out of your own offense, and even if you get hit, the rest of the combo from their side can just whiff. And if it does just whiff, you are often able to get something yourself if they don't stop it in time. So weird to see her in this costume. But I suppose I shall have to get used to it. It's part of this that makes Nico a confusing character, because she almost always, she's extremely precise in that she tends to keep on going forward just enough to hit the next hit of her attacks. If you are at max range, I don't think her combos start to miss. But it might depend on which ones you're doing, and I just happen to always do the ones that do in fact keep on going forward. Yep, learning things even now. Don't have a lot to say because I don't know any of this. Rather, I know the moves, but I do not know why the moves are a plan for this matchup. I suppose it could simply be that Tina has to try to get closer, and hitting her with lows while she's doing that is fairly easy. But there is another option here, I think, from the Tina side. Yeah, that. Just force the opponent to block first, and then go for the throws. Ah, still got it. Okay, I think the adaptations happened. We'll see. Okay, I think I understand it now. Because it's not really that you care whether or not you're doing a lot of damage. This is quite literally the grappler versus footsies matchup. Which I don't think I noticed because I don't think I ever played Nico against Tina if I'm given the option. And given that I only play this game in lounge, I'm always given the option, so sure. I think they might have still had a little bit more options in terms of just attacking more with the intention of forcing the block rather than trying to get into range for anything else. But the question would be what tools you would use for that to begin with, so I can't really say with any certainty. Ah, they're out again in the match. Onward then. Five seconds. Most of the experience you would ever find of a Brad Wong matchup on our channel is from a different player. Most of the advice we have relative to Brad Wong is sound from the basis, but again, is very much for a different player. If you find that I don't have many things to say, it's because I'm watching and figuring out too. No, that's the first thing I'd expect to happen. Brad has so many ways of doing weird things once close that Kasumi doesn't really have a good reason to let him get there if she can avoid it. Defending this is stressful. So your better option is to dash, see which of your dash options takes your opponent most off guard, and then get a knockdown, preferably a long knockdown, and stay out of the way. He's not going to let you throw him easily, he's not going to let you defend yourself properly, and he's not going to let you hit the right buttons in most situations. This is another good option, but I feel like often he just shifts what he's doing and punches you out of the air, because it's not actually unreactable. It depends on the character. There's the advance. This time it did not work, but it was still enough. The question is whether or not the 2P will keep on working. I would say that my understanding of this matchup as shown by these two players is approximately correct and the same. Give Brad lots of space. Lots of space. Sometimes catch yourself if you need to, and otherwise, yeah, just relax, kind of. He doesn't necessarily do crippling damage quickly, so once you've got him down far enough, just tapping at him relatively slowly is generally sufficient. Positioning's right. There we go. And the misleading into throw. The sheer confidence of realizing I don't even have to block that is something that comes from fighting this character enough to know that if he was going to be able to reach you in a single attack, the startup of that attack is extremely telegraphed under most circumstances. He does have a double lunging punch that works, but I think the reason I was saying that the spacing was right was because I believe Pale's Bills was just, literally just out of range of that strike. Or can hold it on reaction, also possible. I think that was 3 wins from their end. So let's rotate at least once. That should be what I'm intending relative to when stream will end. And it's definitely better to get this rematch from the perspective of the other thing that needed to happen. Helena's additional, slightly better throw range helps in this aspect of this matchup quite a lot. Particularly because understanding when you have to block and when you don't is really different for her than it is for other characters. In general, once Kokoro starts attacking, you don't want to try to hit her. Your throws are faster, and your only other problem would be she's too far away for me to throw her. Well, if she was too far away for you for her to be thrown, then you didn't necessarily care that much. You could just keep blocking. In fact, even as a punish, a lot of the time your goal definitely shouldn't be, okay, I'm going to hit you now. Sidestepping will help. Even like you are technically on defense, you were punishing, and now you are sidestepping. Like that works, but that does not work often, and in this case it doesn't help a lot because it's not very much damage, and it doesn't actually advance Helena to where she wants to be relative to Kokoro, which is not this close. That was good, but I think that would have had to like been also a read on the punish. And that, even though it looked like a failure, was in fact the reason why you do this. Because if you do a move, you advance further into Kokoro's space, which means if you mess up the move, you get punished heavily. If you go for a throw and fail the throw and take a hit, often you get pushed back without a real problem occurring as much. And the rest is mostly about measuring distance. If you rewatch that sort of match and think to yourself, okay, I'm just going to learn to hold her strings, it generally doesn't work out as well. Which of the two things you choose to do has a lot to do with the character explicitly that you're playing. But where you stand after the scenario doesn't necessarily matter as much by character. Kokoro will advance, and the only time I think you could say with any certainty that you would be able to tell which move she was going to do in order to hold it would be the second strike of that advance. See, this constant staccato rhythm is very good for both pressure and being confusing in situations where you couldn't otherwise just do what you liked. Her rhythm will always feel off if you're used to two of the other characters in this game. And because she constantly changes both her attack height and her attack limb, you shouldn't spend too much time thinking about that. But there is one, as I said, one timing where you can be reasonably sure of it, and it is being demonstrated now. If she has pushed you away from her, one of two things is about to happen. Either she will do a kick you can easily block, or she will do a mid-punch that you can easily hold. You can't be sure which one is going to happen, But in general, if you are losing, I'd say bet on the hold. Like, how much worse is it really going to get? Remember what the core principle I was mentioning before is, though. You don't have to just sit here and wait for all this. The reason that this works for Kokoro's side is because she can attack from far away that you generally up to her and punch her. Misses, you can do that. She will basically be a freight train coming at you until you recognize I need to make you knock me away. Retreating isn't enough in itself because that's partially putting yourself back into the same situation. It can help, definitely, but don't count on retreating from her being a solution to your problem. Checking her advance, basically the same thing. And as you can see, she actually has tools, specific tools, to get away from both your strikes and your throws in those situations. So it's best to try to avoid them entirely. This can be done by any strong attack you have that you can just do really quickly before you even get close to that scenario. But you, simply speaking, can't usually go, okay, she's far away, she has to come at me, I should hold X, because she is, by design, a character that can come at you basically with all limbs and at all angles. Break hold is helpful, but not a lot. It burns through a lot of your energy to basically usually put you back in a very similar situation. If this feels overwhelming when it's happening, it's kind of supposed to be. If you pay close attention to how the character in general works, she doesn't have a whole lot of other really strong means of attack. This is basically what she's built to do. Control her stance and position very carefully, and if you mess it up, her speed is going to cover the rest of this. With your main issue being simply, can you get enough of your own offense going to force a block? Once you force the block, or manage to just randomly land a hit, now you are in a probably better position. You are the one forcing Kokoro to think, okay, which button do I hit here? Closing through. And again. The amount of advantage you get purely by forcing Kokoro to block even once is fairly staggering. You have to get used to this idea that even one blocked hit is enough to change your situation quite a lot. Even if this starts to happen, you're still not necessarily losing per se. Obviously, this round isn't going well. But it's not the same thing as the situation is out of my control. It's simply a matter of your opponent having a specific response to something that they eventually have to stop doing anyway. Because you're not usually so minus when you're using the style of move anyway, that you can just get thrown. You do often get to tack out of the throw, so after a couple of things like that to take a round or so, it's fairly obvious that they won't be continuing with it. I think this kills. Yes. I have no idea if that was a lag problem or what, but it looks like we're back. the speed of her strikes. Similarly, sidestepping won't always serve you that well. She will keep on coming at you, and normally the next move in the string will track you correctly even if the first one didn't. That was gutsy and extremely correct, as was that. And a quick clip to the head. One of the other really great forms of defense that you gain from playing her in that way is that if your opponent has leaping moves, you generally tend to go under them or through them. This is not an advantage Kasumi actually gets to have. Generally, she doesn't lower her head enough while attacking to just pass through things or try to evade the opponent in that way. In fact, while she does have quite good lows, they're usually either knockdowns or quite close. And generally, I guess the fact that you get the combo or get the position after the knockdown is meant to be where you get the benefit from using them. Both these characters, therefore, can end up just kind of spinning through each other's attacks. The better we get at this matchup, the more it will often be sidestep this, spin, rising strike that. And getting around different other things your opponent is doing, with no specific intention of pulling yourself into weird situations. For this reason, we end up in the same situation as before. Trying to deal with your opponent by actually blocking their stuff or holding their moves is only good when you already know what situation they have gotten themselves into and what they're most likely to try next. If they try something unconventional, chances that you're actually going to hold it, pretty small. But we're in the same space. This means that they're going to whip some things and you will get really surprised at just how far you can grab them from when this happens. Twirl through. Similarly, misleading your opponent with a advancing move that has quick recovery can also help. I keep on forgetting that move is a mid. In order to play this game with strong offense, you have to be really confident in what your throws will do, how far they will reach, and what they are for. And not worry too much about the single hits you take while getting into position for some of them. In fact, keeping calm about those single hits is probably the biggest aspect of this. Do I have the moment? Do I have the opportunity to do the thing I want? And is this gonna kill? It shouldn't. No, I was not close enough to the wall. Oh, that was a counter hit. I should have gone for the other thing. And with that, we are now going into our last on-stream match of the night. The lounge will probably stay open for quite a bit longer, as I think people have been getting more hype and more ready to fight. But, as always, we're going to try to keep the stream and therefore the YouTube content to about an hour long. The return of the Tengu. This is a difficult match for Helena if the Tengu plays defensively, because she can get far enough away to resolve the problem. But the important thing to recognize at that point is, you can in fact, and it is one of the few times in the game where you have to do it, you can in fact just very calmly bulldog your way in here. The problem is the risk-reward part of it. If playing defensively enough, every time you mess it up, you just get knocked off again, and sometimes you get knocked off again with a lot of damage. But since her close-range defense against Helena isn't that great, it doesn't necessarily matter as much. The main thing you have to look out for is that once you are caught in her moveset like this, you're going to take a lot of damage. The easiest answer to this is normally just to go low as you can, because her moves are so weird that trying to figure out your way through them is often a bad idea. Making this, interestingly, one of the cases where the point of the stream, the main thing we were discussing from the beginning, the kind of dashing low, is your best plan. Whereas attempting to control space will mostly result in you being pushed around. Since her close-range defense, while good, is not great, and certainly is mostly dependent on just blocking, your main goal is always don't get punished, it's not necessarily open her up. And unfortunate, I will assume, I'll bet that was not intentional. Similarly, because once she is under this condition, it's so hard for her to do much, your general options once she is close to you are relatively simple too. Once she's close and you don't think she's going to get hit, just throw. I mean, that's what it's for. Other characters will usually figure out some way out of the way, but the Tengu, I find, doesn't manage this very well. Similarly, if you are in the other situation, you can backdash, you could say, out of her stuff, because then without it this happens. But as noted, that burst of information now brings us to the end of the stream. You can join us tomorrow for DNF Duel, our Do Not Falter Battle Lounge content, and on Monday for more mishmashing Battle Lounge in Street Fighter V. Tuesday and Wednesday are up in the air because the anime games are much harder to deal with in the heat. But you might still get your Feeling Thursday Battle Lounge for King of Fighters. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org, and any information about us streaming or not streaming due to heat or similar at 2_mk_FGC on Twitter. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.